The crystal hall of the Lunar Court shimmered with anticipation as 300 Omegas from across the 5 territories gathered, each one perfumed, adorned, and desperate to become the chosen mate of Alpha King Cassian Nightshade. Meanwhile, Lyric, a mute servant girl, knelt in the corner, carefully mending a torn banner, her hands steady even as her heart whispered warnings she could never voice aloud. The marking ceremony happened once every generation, a sacred tradition where the reigning Alpha King would choose his mate from among the realm's most eligible Omegas. Tonight wasn't just any royal gathering, it was the event that would determine the future queen of the 5 territories, and every Omega with even a drop of noble blood had traveled for days, sometimes weeks, to attend. Lyric kept her eyes down as she worked, her nimble fingers weaving silver thread through the ceremonial silk. She'd learned long ago that invisibility was her greatest asset. Born without a voice, abandoned as an infant at the palace gates, she'd been raised by the palace staff and given work as soon as her hands were steady enough to hold a needle. Pertimator. Now, at 22, she was the best seamstress in the Lunar Court, though few knew her name, and even fewer knew her face. "Move aside, girl," a sharp voice commanded. Lyric looked up to see Lady Seraphine of the Western Peaks sweeping past, her emerald gown trailing across the floor. Lyric had just polished. The Omega didn't even glance down, too busy adjusting her bodice to notice or care that she'd knocked over Lyric's sewing basket. Lyric quickly gathered the scattered spools of thread, her cheeks burning with practiced humiliation. This was her place. This was what she knew. Across the vast hall, Alpha King Cassian Nightshade stood on the raised dais, his commanding presence drawing every eye like moths to flame. At 28, he was everything an Alpha King should be: tall, powerfully built, with dark hair that fell just past his collar, and eyes the color of storm clouds. His reputation preceded him, a brilliant strategist, a fierce warrior, and unfortunately for the hopeful Omegas crowding closer, notoriously uninterested in the politics of mating bonds. "Your Majesty surely must choose tonight," urged Elder Mordecai, one of the 5 council members flanking the king. "The bloodline must continue. The territories need stability." "The territories need competent leadership," Cassian replied coolly, his gaze sweeping over the sea of eager faces below. "Not a breeding program." Elder Mordecai's jaw tightened, but he pressed on. "With respect, Your Majesty, you've refused every suitable Omega presented to you for the past 5 years. The council has been patient, but poured. But tonight you've cornered me with 300 of them at once," Cassian finished, a sardonic smile playing at his lips. "Clever. Podhasses. Clever. Podhasses. 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 Podhasses." It was true. The council had grown tired of his excuses, his delays, his complete disinterest in choosing a mate. So they'd orchestrated this, a marking ceremony on such a grand scale that refusing would be a direct insult to every territory represented. Cassian's eyes continued their sweep of the room, not really seeing any of the faces that stared back at him with desperate hope. The Omegas were beautiful, certainly. Accomplished, well-bred, politically advantageous, everything a king should want, everything except interesting. His gaze snagged on movement in the far corner, a flash of copper hair, a girl kneeling on the floor, gathering something with quick, graceful movements. She wasn't dressed like the others. Her clothes were simple, a plain gray dress that marked her as palace staff, and unlike every other Omega in the room, she wasn't looking at him at all. For the first time that evening, Cassian felt genuine curiosity stir. 3 hours, he muttered to himself, echoing the sentiment of probably the only other person in the room who wasn't thrilled to be here. Just 3 hours until this circus ends. Though neither of them knew it yet, the circus was only just beginning. Lyric had learned to read Cassian Nightshade long before most people in the palace even knew she existed. It had started 5 years ago, when she was 17, and he was newly crowned after his father's sudden death. She'd been repairing tapestries in the council chamber when he'd stormed in after a particularly heated meeting. Not noticing her perched on the scaffolding above, he'd pace like a caged wolf, muttering to himself about insufferable old men and political puppetry, and she'd stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, until he'd finally left. After that, she'd seen him everywhere. In hallways where he'd paused by windows, staring out at the mountains. In the library, late at night, surrounded by strategy books and maps. In the training yard at dawn, working through sword forms with a violence that spoke of internal battles more than external ones. And he'd started seeing her too, though differently than he saw others. "You there!" Cassian's voice cut through her thoughts, and Lyric's head snapped up to find the Alpha King standing directly in front of her, having descended from the dais while she'd been lost in memory. The Omegas nearby tittered with jealousy and confusion. Why was he talking to a servant? Lyric quickly stood, dropping into a curtsy, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "That banner," Cassian gestured to the one she'd been mending. "Will it be ready before the ceremony begins?" Lyric nodded once, emphatic. "Good." He paused, and she could feel his eyes on her, studying her in that unnerving way he had. "You're the one who repaired my father's war standard last month, aren't you? The one they said was beyond saving." Another nod. Heat crept up her neck. "Impressive work?" he said, and there was something in his tone, a warmth that he certainly hadn't used when addressing the Omegas vying for his attention. "What's your name?" Lyric's throat worked uselessly. "Power lips?" She looked up at him, meeting those storm-gray eyes, and touched her throat, then her lips, shaking her head slowly. Understanding, flickered across Cassian's face. "You can't speak." She nodded, grateful he'd grasped it quickly. Some people took much longer, growing impatient or uncomfortable. "Can you write?" Lyric hesitated, then made a so-so gesture with her hand. She could write, but not well. Letters had been a luxury, and she'd only learned the basics from the head housekeeper who'd taken pity on her. "Process. Sign then?" Cassian asked, surprising her. Not many people knew about the hand language used by the deaf and mute communities in the Eastern Territories. Lyric's eyes widened. She signed quickly. "You know the old tongue?" A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "My mother was from the Eastern Reaches. She taught me before she died." He signed back. "What is your name?" "Lyric," she responded, the sign graceful, her hand moving from her heart to her lips, the symbol for song that cannot be sung. "Lyric," he repeated aloud, and the way he said it made something flutter dangerously in her chest. "It suits you." "Your Majesty." Elder Mordecai's voice carried across the hall, sharp with disapproval. "The ceremony is about to begin. You mustn't delay any longer." Cassian's expression shuddered immediately, the brief warmth vanishing behind his usual mask of cool indifference. But before he turned away, he signed one more thing, so quickly that Lyric almost missed it. "Stay close tonight. I may need a friendly face in this den of wolves." Then he was gone, striding back to the dais, leaving Lyric standing motionless, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her sewing basket. "Did you see that?" she heard one Omega whisper to another. "He actually stopped to talk to a servant. How peculiar." "Probably asking her to fetch him wine," another replied dismissively. "You know how he is. Always trying to delay the inevitable." Lyric returned to her corner, but her mind was spinning. In 5 years of silent observation, she'd developed what the other servants jokingly called her gift, an uncanny ability to read people, to see the truth beneath their masks. When you couldn't speak, you learned to listen and watch with exceptional care. And Cassian Nightshade, for all his reputation as a cold, disinterested king, had looked at her with something she'd never seen him direct at anyone else. Genuine recognition. Not of her status or usefulness, but of her as a person. It was dangerous, she knew, to let that recognition mean anything. He was an Alpha King. She was a mute servant with no family, no name, no prospects. The Omegas glittering around the hall were her betters in every measurable way. But her heart, traitorous thing that it was, had already begun to hope. The marking ceremony began with all the pomp and grandeur expected of such an occasion. Elder Mordecai stood at the center of the dais, his voice ringing through the crystal hall as he recited the ancient words of the bonding ritual. Lyric watched from her shadowed corner as Omega after Omega was presented to the king, each one curtsying deeply, each one offering their neck in the traditional gesture of submission. The mark of a true alpha. The bite that would create an unbreakable bond was the highest honor an Omega could receive, and every woman in that hall would have given anything for it. Cassian remained seated on his throne, his expression carefully neutral, as he acknowledged each presentation with a slight nod before moving on to the next. Lyric could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened incrementally with each passing Omega. He didn't want any of them. The realization should have brought her relief, confirmation that her observations were correct, that he truly was as disinterested in these political matches as his reputation suggested. Instead, it made her chest ache with an emotion she had no right to feel. 2 hours passed. The presentations continued. Some Omegas tried to engage him in conversation, others relied on their appearance alone. A few were bold enough to touch his hand or arm, a breach of protocol that Elder Mordecai frowned at but didn't prevent. Nothing worked. Cassian remained unmoved, a statue of indifference. Then Lady Seraphine approached, carrying a crystal goblet filled with ceremonial wine. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice honey-sweet as she sank into an elegant curtsy. "Please, allow me to offer you refreshment. The presentations have been long, and you must be parched." It was a calculated move, presenting herself as nurturing and attentive, qualities supposedly desired in a queen. Cassian regarded the goblet for a moment, then accepted it with a slight inclination of his head. "Thank you, Lady Seraphine," he said formally, raising the goblet to his lips. Lyric's eyes had been drifting toward the banner she still needed to hang, but something made her look back at that precise moment. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was the slight stiffness in Seraphine's smile, but Lyric's gaze sharpened. She saw Cassian drink deeply. She saw him lower the goblet, and then she saw his expression change, confusion flickering across his face, followed by something that looked almost like alarm. The goblet slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor. "Your Majesty?" Elder Mordecai stepped forward, concern creasing his weathered face. Cassian tried to stand but swayed violently. His hand shot out to grip the arm of his throne, knuckles white with effort. "I don't," his words came out slurred. "Something's..." Then his eyes rolled back, and the Alpha King of the 5 territories collapsed. Chaos erupted instantly. Omegas screamed. Guards rushed forward. The council members shouted orders that contradicted each other in their panic. But Lyric was already moving. Her sewing basket fell forgotten as she sprinted across the hall, pushing through the crowd with surprising strength. She reached Cassian before anyone else, dropping to her knees beside him, and immediately checking his pulse with practiced fingers. The head housekeeper had taught her basic healing after she'd shown aptitude for powers. His heartbeat was strong but slow. Too slow. "Get back." A guard grabbed her arm roughly. "Away from His Majesty." Lyric wrenched free and pointed frantically at the shattered goblet, then at Seraphine, then made a drinking gesture followed by a collapsing motion. "She's hysterical," someone said. "Remove her." "No, wait." Another voice, this one belonging to Captain Rowan, the head of the King's Guard. "She's trying to tell us something." "The wine, check the wine." A healer finally arrived, an elderly woman named Mistress Adeline, who knelt beside Cassian and began her examination. Lyric stayed close, her hands hovering uselessly, wanting desperately to help but not knowing how. "Poison?" Captain Rowan asked grimly. "No," Mistress Adeline said after a moment. "His vitals are stable. This is something else. Something magical." She looked up at the crowd. "Who gave him that wine?" All eyes turned to Lady Seraphine, who had gone pale as fresh snow. I didn't," she stammered, taking a step backward. "It was just ceremonial wine. I wouldn't." "Seize her," Captain Rowan commanded. As guards moved to comply, Lyric looked down at Cassian's face. Even unconscious, even vulnerable, he was striking. And for just a moment, with his defenses completely gone, she thought she saw something she'd only ever glimpsed in stolen glances and brief encounters. Loneliness. A loneliness that matched her own. "Wake up," she thought desperately, her hands clenching into fists against her thighs. "Please wake up." But the Alpha King remained silent and still, and Lyric's voiceless prayer went unanswered. The king's private chambers had been transformed into a command center within minutes. Cassian lay on his massive bed, still unconscious, while guards stood at every entrance, and council members argued in increasingly frantic tones. Lyric had been swept along in the chaos, her protests signed frantically, but unnoticed ignored, as Mistress Adeline had insisted she stay close. "You were the first to reach him," the healer had said. "You may have noticed details others missed." Now Lyric stood pressed against the wall, trying to remain invisible while her mind raced. She'd picked up the shattered goblet pieces before being ushered out of the crystal hall, and now she studied them carefully, sniffing delicately. Beneath the wine's rich aroma was something else. Something floral and sickeningly sweet, with an underlying bitterness that made her nose wrinkle. "Explain yourself!" Elder Mordecai's voice boomed as Lady Seraphine was dragged into the chamber, flanked by guards. "I'm innocent," Seraphine cried, tears streaming down her face. "I would never harm His Majesty. I love him." "Love?" Captain Rowan's voice was ice. "This is your definition of love." "No, you don't understand." Seraphine's composure cracked completely. "It's not poison, it's a bonding elixir." From the northern covens. It was supposed to help him recognize his true mate. The room fell silent. "A bonding elixir." Mistress Adeline repeated slowly, her expression shifting from alarm to grim understanding. "Oh, you foolish girl. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Seraphine faltered. "I was told it was harmless, that it would simply help him see clearly, help him recognize which Omega he was truly meant to bond with. That's all." "Who told you this?" Elder Mordecai demanded. "Ambassador Thrace, from the Northern Territories," Seraphine admitted. "He said his king wanted to help facilitate a successful match, to strengthen alliances between our territories. He gave me the elixir, and told me to slip it into His Majesty's wine during the ceremony." Captain Rowan swore viciously. This was a plot. The Northern King orchestrated this. "But why?" another council member asked. "What does King Valdis gain from this?" Mistress Adeline stood from where she'd been examining Cassian, her expression grave. "If I'm correct about which elixir was used and given the symptoms, I believe I am then King Valdis gains quite a lot." She turned to address the room. "A bonding elixir doesn't work the way Lady Seraphine was told. It doesn't help an alpha see clearly. It puts him into a deep sleep, a magical stasis, until he's awakened by his true mate's mark." "His true mate's mark?" Elder Mordecai paled. "You mean—" "A bite," Mistress Adeline confirmed. "The bonding bite that creates the mate bond. The alpha must be bitten by the Omega he's truly destined for. Only then will he wake." Lyric's hands clenched around the goblet shards, her heart sinking. "So we simply need to determine which Omega is his true mate and have her bite him?" One of the younger council members said, almost relieved. "That's manageable." "Is it?" Mistress Adeline's voice was sharp. "Tell me, how do you propose we determine which of the 300 Omegas gathered here tonight is the king's true mate?" "True bonding is rare enough. Most wolves never find their destined match. And even if His Majesty's true mate is here, she would have to feel the bond strongly enough to successfully wake him. Pasa, the bite must be genuine, driven by real recognition and desire." The implications settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. "We'll have them all try," Captain Rowan said finally. "Every Omega who attended the ceremony. One of them must be the right one." Paused. "And if none of them are?" Elder Mordecai asked quietly. No one had an answer. "There's more," Mistress Adeline added, her voice heavy. "According to the ancient texts on bonding elixirs, if His Majesty isn't awakened within 3 days, the sleep becomes permanent. His body will continue to function, but his mind will be lost, trapped in an endless dream. He'll be alive but gone. 3 days." Lyric's breath caught in her throat. 3 days to find Cassian's true mate among 300 Omegas, or lose him forever. "Then we begin immediately," Captain Rowan Akai declared. "Captain Rowan, gather every Omega who attended the ceremony. We'll start the trials at once." As the room erupted into organized chaos, Lyric looked down at Cassian's peaceful face. In sleep, he looked younger, the weight of kingship temporarily lifted. She remembered the way he'd smiled at her earlier, the warmth in his eyes when he'd signed her name. Stay close tonight, he'd told her. I may need a friendly face. She hadn't known how prophetic those words would be. A hand touched her shoulder, making her jump. Mistress Adeline stood beside her, her expression kind but searching. You were the first to reach him, the healer said quietly. And you tried to warn us about the wine. How did you know? Lyric hesitated, then signed slowly. Her smile was wrong, forced, and I could smell something in the wine. You could smell it? Mistress Adeline's eyebrows rose. From across the room? Lyric nodded. She'd always had an unusually keen sense of smell, a compensation for her lack of voice, perhaps. It was another reason she was so good at her work. She could identify dyes and fabrics by scent alone. Remarkable, the healer murmured. Then, with a gentle pat on Lyric's shoulder, stay close, child. Something tells me you may be needed before this is over. Lyric wanted to ask how, wanted to protest that she was nobody, nothing, certainly not someone who belonged in a king's chamber during a crisis. But she had no voice, and perhaps no right to question. So she simply nodded and returned to her place against the wall, watching and waiting as the desperate search for Cassian's true mate began. The trials began within the hour. The king's chambers had been closed off to all but essential personnel. But the antechamber had been converted into a waiting area where Omegas lined up, each one desperate for the chance to be the one who would wake the Alpha King. Lyric had positioned herself near the doorway, ostensibly to assist Mistress Adeline, but really because the thought of leaving Cassian's side felt impossible. She'd been given a simple task: observe each Omega as they entered and exited, note any changes in the king's condition. What she was really doing was torturing herself. The first Omega to enter was Lady Seraphine herself. Despite her role in the disaster, she'd convinced the council to let her try, insisting through desperate tears that she truly loved the king, that perhaps she was his destined mate, and that's why the elixir had called to her to administer it. Lyric watched through the partially open door as Seraphine approached the bed, leaned down, and pressed her mouth to Cassian's neck. Not a true bonding bite. Those required the partial shift that brought out an Omega's fangs, but a kiss to the traditional marking spot. Nothing happened. Seraphine tried again, this time allowing her fangs to descend, placing them against Cassian's skin with gentle pressure. Still nothing. The king remained deeply asleep, his breathing unchanged. Next, Captain Rowan said firmly, pulling Seraphine away as she dissolved into sobs. The second Omega tried, then the third, then the 10th. Each time, Lyric felt something twist in her chest. It was irrational, she knew, to feel this sharp stab of jealousy, watching Omega after Omega put their mouths on Cassian's skin. He was unconscious. This was about saving his life, not romance. But her heart didn't seem to care about logic. This is taking too long. Elder Mordecai fretted after the 20th unsuccessful attempt. At this rate, we'll never get through all 300 in 3 days. Then we'll work in shifts, Captain Rowan decided, through the night if necessary. And so they did. Lyric remained at her post as the hours crawled by, watching a parade of beautiful, accomplished Omegas try and fail to wake the king. Some were confident, others nervous. Some lingered over the attempt, others were perfunctory. None succeeded. Somewhere around the 50th attempt, Lyric noticed something. Many of the Omegas weren't actually trying to wake Cassian. They were performing for the watching council members, making a show of their devotion and worthiness. Their bites were theatrical rather than genuine, their expressions calculated. They didn't love him. They loved the idea of being queen. Your Majesty? One Omega cooed as she leaned over Cassian, loud enough for the council to hear. I've dreamed of this moment since I was a girl. Please wake for me. Lyric's hands clenched into fists. That Omega Lady Viridian from the southern marshes had been overheard earlier, laughing about how she'd redecorate the dreadfully dull royal chambers once she was queen. The bite was gentle, almost tentative. Cassian didn't stir. Next, as dawn broke over the palace, they'd made it through 100 Omegas, 100 failures. The council members looked exhausted. Captain Rowan was drinking his 4th pot of coffee, and Mistress Adeline had developed a permanent crease between her eyebrows. Lyric felt hollowed out, scraped raw by each successive attempt. She kept telling herself it was fear for Cassian, worry about what would happen if they didn't find his mate in time. But she knew, in the secret depths of her heart, that it was more than that. It was the growing, terrible certainty that when they finally found the right Omega, because surely they would, there were still 200 to try. Lyric would have to watch Cassian wake up, look into someone else's eyes, and claim them as his mate. She'd have to watch him love someone else. The thought made her want to curl into a ball and disappear, but she forced herself to remain upright, to keep observing, to keep hoping that somehow, impossibly, this would all work out. The girl needs rest, Mistress Adeline said suddenly, gesturing to Lyric. She's been standing for hours without food or water. Well, I'm fine. Lyric signed, but Mistress Adeline waved her off. That wasn't a suggestion, child. Go to the kitchens, eat something, rest for an hour. We'll continue here. Power. Reluctantly, Lyric obeyed. But as she walked through the palace corridors, she found her feet carrying her not to the kitchens, but to the small chapel in the eastern wing, a quiet place where she often went when the world became too overwhelming. She knelt on the cold stone floor and did something she hadn't done since she was a child. She prayed. Not with words, of course, but with her whole heart, with every fiber of her being. She sent a desperate plea out into the universe. Please let him wake up. I don't care if it's not me. I don't care if I have to watch him love someone else for the rest of my life. Just please let him wake up, Problem. And then, because she couldn't help herself, she added one more selfish, impossible wish. But if there's any chance, any possibility, that I could be the one. She didn't finish the thought. It was too dangerous, too foolish, too far beyond what someone like her was allowed to hope for. But the wish hung in the air nonetheless, silent and yearning, just like Lyric herself. When Lyric returned to the king's chambers an hour later, she found the atmosphere had shifted. The steady rhythm of Omega after Omega, attempting to wake Cassian, had been interrupted by a new arrival, a woman Lyric had never seen before. She was older than most of the Omegas in attendance, perhaps in her early 30s, with striking features and an air of quiet dignity. Her clothes marked her as someone of status, but not from any of the 5 territories. The cut of her dress and the style of her hair suggested the far eastern provinces, beyond even the eastern reaches. This is Omega Mirren, Elder Mordecai was explaining to Captain Rowan as Lyric slipped back into her corner. She served as a companion to His Majesty several years ago, before his coronation. Something cold settled in Lyric's stomach at the way Mordecai said companion. We thought she might have insight into His Majesty's true feelings. Another council member added, perhaps she knows something that could help us identify his destined mate. Mirren stood at the foot of Cassian's bed, her expression unreadable as she gazed down at him. He looks peaceful, she said softly. That's rare for him. Even in sleep, he was usually troubled. The casual intimacy of the statement, the knowledge of how Cassian slept, made Lyric's chest tighten painfully. How long were you two involved? Captain Rowan asked, not unkindly. 2 years, Mirren replied. Though involved is perhaps too strong a word. We were close. He sought comfort in my company, and I cared for him deeply. But when his father died and he became king, he ended things immediately. Why? Elder Mordecai leaned forward with interest. Mirren's smile was sad. Because he didn't love me. Not the way a mate should be loved. He was honest about that from the beginning. He made no promises, offered no bond. And when duty called, he answered. That's who Cassian is. She turned to face the council members directly. You want to know who his true mate might be? I can't tell you that. In 2 years, I never saw him look at anyone the way true mates look at each other. He was always, she paused, searching for words. Always searching for something he couldn't name. Someone he couldn't find. That's not helpful, Elder Mordecai said, frustrated. Isn't it? Mirren's gaze swept the room and landed, surprisingly, on Lyric. Perhaps you're looking in the wrong places. Perhaps his true mate isn't among the noble Omegas at all. Lyric froze as several pairs of eyes turned toward her. That's absurd, one of the council members scoffed. His Majesty would never bond with a mere servant. Why not? Mirren challenged. True bonds don't care about status or politics. They simply are. Nevertheless, Elder Mordecai said firmly, we must focus on the Omegas actually in attendance at the ceremony. Speaking of which, Omega Mirren, would you be willing to attempt to wake His Majesty yourself? Mirren looked surprised. I'm not his true mate. I already told you. Humor us, Captain Rowan said. At this point, we're trying everything. With a slight shrug, Mirren approached the bed. She sat carefully on the edge, reached out to brush a strand of dark hair from Cassian's forehead, a gesture so familiar and tender that Lyric had to look away. Forgive me, old friend, Mirren murmured, then leaned down and placed a gentle bite against his neck. Nothing happened. Mirren pulled back, unsurprised. As I said, not his true mate. She stood and turned to the council. But I'll stay, if you'll allow it. I'd like to make sure he wakes up. Despite everything, I still care about him. Of course, Elder Mordecai agreed, though he looked disappointed. As Mirren moved away from the bed, she paused beside Lyric's corner. Up close, she was even more striking, with warm brown eyes that seemed to see far too much. You're the one who first reached him when he collapsed, Mirren said quietly. It wasn't a question. Lyric nodded warily. And you've been here all night, watching over him. Again, not a question. Mirren tilted her head, studying Lyric with the same intensity Cassian sometimes did. Can you speak? Lyric shook her head, touching her throat. But you can hear perfectly well. Mirren smiled slightly. Then hear this. Don't give up hope. Sometimes the people we love surprise us. Before Lyric could process that statement, or the fact that this stranger had somehow intuited her feelings, Mirren had moved away to speak with Mistress Adeline. Trials continued. More Omegas cycled through, each one failing to wake the king. The council grew more desperate, the atmosphere more tense. Lyric tried to focus on her observations, on the task Mistress Adeline had given her, but Mirren's words kept echoing in her head. Don't give up hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope was painful. Hope was for people who had the right to dream of impossible things. But despite everything, despite all the reasons she shouldn't, Lyric found she couldn't quite extinguish the small, stubborn flame that had kindled in her chest. Around mid-afternoon of the second day, another commotion drew Lyric's attention to the doorway. A man she didn't recognize, expensively dressed, with the bearing of nobility, was arguing with Captain Rowan. I demand to see Lady Seraphine immediately, the man was saying, his voice carrying an accent from the Northern Territories. I am Ambassador Thrace, and I have diplomatic immunity. You have nothing, Captain Rowan growled, except a cell waiting for you. You orchestrated an attack on our king. An attack? Thrace looked genuinely shocked. I did no such thing. I merely provided Lady Seraphine with a harmless bonding aid. That's put His Majesty in a magical coma, Captain Rowan finished. Guards, take him. As Thrace was dragged away, still protesting his innocence, Elder Mordecai turned to the remaining council members with a grim expression. We need to question him thoroughly. If King Valdis of the Northern Territories orchestrated this as an act of war, or as revenge, another council member interjected. Remember, His Majesty rejected the Northern Princess rather publicly last year. Lyric's mind raced. This was more than just a bonding elixir gone wrong. This was politics, revenge, possibly even an act of war. And Cassian was caught in the middle, helpless and vulnerable. The weight of it all pressed down on her. 300 Omegas, and none of them his true mate. Political conspiracies and diplomatic incidents. Time running out with each passing hour. And Lyric, voiceless and powerless, could do nothing but watch and hope and pray that somehow, someone would find a way to bring Cassian back. The interrogation of Ambassador Thrace took place in a secure room adjacent to the king's chambers, and though Lyric had no official reason to be present, no one thought to exclude her. She'd become a fixture in the background, easy to overlook and easier to forget. Which meant she heard everything. I'll ask you one more time. Captain Rowan's voice was dangerously soft. Did you know the true effects of the bonding elixir you gave to Lady Seraphine? Thrace, his earlier bluster deflated by hours of interrogation, slumped in his chair. I knew it would put him to sleep. He admitted finally, I knew about the true mate condition. but I swear on my life, I was told he would wake within 3 days regardless. That the sleep was temporary. Who told you that? Elder Mordecai demanded. My king, King Valdis. Thrace looked between them desperately. He said it was harmless. A way to force Alpha King Cassian to confront his own feelings, to stop hiding behind his reputation, and actually choose a mate. When he woke without anyone successfully awakening him, he'd be humiliated, yes, but unharmed. That was the plan. And you believed him? Mistress Adeline, who had joined the interrogation, looked incredulous. An ancient bonding elixir, harmless? King Valdis showed me texts, documentation from the Northern Covens themselves, Thrace insisted. They specified a 3-day limit. Process. After that, the subject wakes on their own, unharmed but thoroughly embarrassed that no one loved them enough to break the spell. Captain Rowan exchanged a look with Elder Mordecai. He lied to you. What? Thrace paled. Quote, the texts we have, Mistress Adeline said quietly, indicate that after 3 days, the sleep becomes permanent, not temporary. Your king sent you here with a weapon, Ambassador, whether you knew it or not. Thrace looked like he might be sick. But why? What does he gain from permanently incapacitating Alpha King Cassian? Chaos, Elder Mordecai said grimly. The 5 territories without a functioning king would destabilize the entire region. And with King Cassian unable to rule but technically still alive, we couldn't even crown a successor. Potus. We'd be trapped in political limbo, vulnerable to invasion or annexation. By the Northern Territories, Captain Rowan finished. Your king isn't just seeking revenge for his daughter's rejection. He's making a play for power. Thrace buried his face in his hands. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know. Lyric believed him. She could see the genuine horror in his expression, smell the acrid fear sweat that had broken out on his skin. He'd been used, just as Lady Seraphine had been used pawns in a larger game. There's more, Mistress Adeline said, pulling out an ancient leather-bound tome. I've been researching the specific elixir used, and I found something troubling in the old texts. Everyone leaned forward. The true mate condition, she continued, is more specific than we initially understood. It's not enough for someone to simply be the king's destined mate, if such a person even exists. The Omega must not only recognize the bond but must claim it willingly, with full knowledge of what they're doing. She paused. And there's another condition we missed. The Omega must be unpromised. Unpromised? Elder Mordecai frowned. Unmated, unbonded, and without any formal courtship agreements, Mistress Adeline clarified. The magic requires absolute freedom of choice. A heavy silence fell over the room. That eliminates at least 50 of the Omegas still waiting to try, Captain Rowan said slowly. Many of them have informal courtship arrangements with other alphas. They came to the ceremony hoping to trade up, so to speak, but they're not truly free. Which means, Elder Mordecai added, voice tight with stress, we've wasted hours on Omegas who could never have worked anyway. We'll need to screen the remaining candidates, Captain Rowan decided. Only truly unpromised Omegas will be allowed to continue the trials. As the interrogation wrapped up and Ambassador Thrace was led away to a cell, Lyric slipped back into the king's chambers. The afternoon sun was slanting through the tall windows, painting Cassian's still form in golden light. 2 days gone. 1 day remaining. Mirren sat in a chair near the bed, having appointed herself an unofficial guardian. She looked up when Lyric entered and patted the chair beside her. Lyric hesitated. Then Saturday? You heard? Mirren asked quietly. Lyric nodded. It's worse than we thought. Then, Mirren turned back to Cassian. A political plot, not just a personal revenge. And the condition about being unpromised. She trailed off, then looked at Lyric with sudden intensity. You're unpromised, aren't you? Lyric flushed, signing quickly. I'm a servant. No one would promise themselves to me. Passers. That's not what I asked. Yes, Lyric admitted. I'm unpromised. But I'm also not. She struggled for the sign, then made a gesture that encompassed the room full of noble Omegas. I'm not like them. I don't belong here. How fen. Maybe that's exactly why you do belong here, Mirren said cryptically. Tell me something when you look at him. What do you feel? Lyric's hands trembled as she signed. I feel like I can't breathe. Like the world is too bright and too dark at the same time. Like if he never wakes up, something in me will break that can never be fixed. Mirren smiled, sad and knowing. That's what I thought. She reached over and squeezed Lyric's hand. Don't let fear make your choices for you, child. Some opportunities only come once. Before Lyric could ask what she meant, Elder Mordecai entered with a new list. We've identified 73 Omegas, who are confirmed, unpromised, and eligible to continue the trials, he announced. We'll begin immediately with this new information. As the trials resumed with fresh urgency, Lyric watched Omega after Omega approach Cassian's bed. Each one was beautiful, accomplished, well-bred. Each one was everything a queen should be. And each one failed. Power, the sun set, night fell. The trials continued by candlelight. 50 attempts. 60, 70. Nothing worked. With each failure, the desperate energy in the room grew thicker, more suffocating. Time was running out, and everyone could feel it. Around midnight, Elder Mordecai called a halt. That's all of them, he said, his voice heavy with defeat. Every eligible Omega has tried, none succeeded. Then his true mate wasn't at the ceremony? Captain Rowan said, though he looked ill at the thought. We'll need to send riders to every territory, bring in more candidates. We don't have time, Mistress Adeline interrupted. The third day ends at sunset tomorrow. Even if we sent riders now, they couldn't return with new candidates in time. The weight of those words settled over the room like a death shroud. So that's it, one of the council members said, his voice cracking. The king is lost? No one answered. Lyric looked at Cassian's peaceful face and felt something break inside her chest. This couldn't be how it ended. It couldn't be. Mirren caught her eye across the room and mouthed a single word. Try. But Lyric shook her head frantically. She wasn't an Omega who had attended the ceremony. She had no status, no right. The very idea was absurd. Impossible. Foolish beyond measure. And yet, as the council members began discussing funeral preparations and succession plans, as hope died in the faces around her, Lyric found herself standing, found herself walking toward the bed, found herself making a choice that would change everything. Every eye in the room fixed on Lyric as she approached Cassian's bed with trembling steps. What is she doing? One of the council members asked. Stop her. Another ordered. She has no right. Wait. Mirren's voice cut through the protests. Let her try. Let a servant try to wake the king? Elder Mordecai looked scandalized. This is absurd. She wasn't even at the ceremony. She was absolutely at the ceremony. Mistress, Adeline spoke up suddenly. I saw her there myself, working on the ceremonial banners. She's as eligible as anyone. She's a mute servant with no breeding, no family, no promises. Captain Rowan interrupted, his expression thoughtful as he studied Lyric. She's unpromised, Preciata. And she was the first to reach His Majesty when he collapsed, the first to try to warn us about the wine. That doesn't mean anything, Elder Mordecai protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Lyric reached the bedside and looked down at Cassian. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. This was madness. She was about to humiliate herself in front of the entire council, prove to everyone and to herself that she was exactly what they said. A nobody with delusions above her station. But if she didn't try, she would never know, and not knowing would haunt her for the rest of her life. She looked back at the assembled group and signed, May I? There was a long pause. Then, surprisingly, Elder Mordecai sighed. At this point, what harm could it do? If she fails like all the others, we're no worse off than we are now. And if she succeeds? Captain Rowan asked quietly. Then the gods have a sense of humor, Mordecai replied dryly, permission granted. Lyric turned back to Cassian. Up close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight stubble shadowing his jaw. She could smell his scent pine and smoke and something uniquely him that made her heart ache. I'm sorry, she thought, knowing he couldn't hear her. I'm sorry for presuming. I'm sorry for hoping. I'm sorry for being foolish enough to think that maybe, possibly, I could be. She couldn't finish the thought. Instead, she leaned down slowly, giving herself time to back out, time to come to her senses. Her lips hovered over his neck, over the traditional marking spot where every Omega before her had placed their bite. She could feel his pulse beneath his skin, steady and strong. Could feel the warmth of his body, could smell that intoxicating scent that made her dizzy. This was wrong. She shouldn't. But she was so tired of shouldn't, so tired of being silent, of being invisible, of letting fear make her choices. Just this once, she wanted to choose. Lyric let her Omega fangs descend small, sharp canines designed for the bonding bite. She placed them carefully against Cassian's skin, right over his pulse point. And then she paused. Because suddenly, impossibly, she could feel something. A pull, like an invisible thread connecting her chest to his. A warmth that started in her core and spread outward. A recognition so deep it felt like coming home. Oh, she thought, tears springing to her eyes. Oh no. He was her true mate. She knew it with absolute certainty, felt it in every cell of her body. The bond was there, had probably been there for years, just waiting for them both to recognize it. Which meant that when this didn't work because it couldn't. She was nobody, and he was a king. She would spend the rest of her life knowing exactly what she'd lost. But she'd come this far. Lyric closed her eyes, let herself feel the bond pulling taut between them, and bit down. Not hard enough to break skin. Bonding bites were more symbolic than damaging, but firm enough to mark, to claim, to say with her body what her voice never could. You are mine and I am yours, and I choose this even knowing it will break me. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, wait, Mistress Adeline gasped. His pulse. Lyric felt it before anyone announced it, felt Cassian's heartbeat accelerate beneath her lips, felt his chest expand with a deeper breath, felt the bond between them suddenly pull tight, then settle into place with a rightness that made her knees weak. She pulled back, eyes wide, hardly daring to hope. Cassian's eyes fluttered, opened. Those storm-gray eyes she'd memorized over 5 years of stolen glances, focused slowly, tracking across the ceiling before landing on her face. Lyric? His voice was rough with sleep, confused but alert. What? He tried to sit up. Captain Rowan rushed forward to help him, and the room erupted into chaos. Your Majesty. He's awake, praise the gods. But Lyric barely heard any of it. Because Cassian's hand had shot out and caught her wrist before she could step away. And he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Shock. Wonder. Something that looked almost like recognition. You, he said, his grip tightening. It was you. Lyric tried to pull away, panic rising in her chest. She'd done it. She'd woken him. Which meant everyone now knew that she was his true mate. And the humiliation and impossibility of that fact was crashing down on her with crushing weight. She wrenched her wrist free and ran. Behind her, she heard Cassian call her name, heard footsteps starting to follow, heard Mistress Adeline say something about giving her a moment. But Lyric didn't stop. She ran through the corridors, down servant stairs, through passages only palace staff knew, until she reached the only place she'd ever felt truly safe, the small sewing room in the eastern tower. Where she did her work. She slammed the door behind her, slid down to the floor, and finally let herself break. Silent sobs racked her body as the full weight of what had just happened crashed over her. She'd woken him. She was his true mate. And now everyone knew the council, the court, probably half the palace by now. She was a mute servant, who had just been revealed as the true mate of the Alpha King. There was no world in which this ended well. The bond in her chest pulled tight, urging her to go back, to go to him. But Lyric wrapped her arms around herself and stayed exactly where she was, too afraid to face what came next. Lyric had been hiding in her sewing room for 3 hours, when the door finally opened. She looked up, expecting Mistress Adeline or perhaps Mirren. Instead, Cassian himself stood in the doorway, still wearing the formal clothes from the ceremony, now rumpled from sleep. Her heart jumped into her throat. She scrambled to her feet, pressing herself against the far wall as if she could disappear into it. "Don't," Cassian said quietly, holding up a hand. "Don't run again, please." Lyric stayed where she was, but only because her legs felt too unsteady to carry her. She watched warily as he stepped into the small room, having to duck slightly under the low doorframe. He looked around at her workspace, the neat stacks of fabric, the organized spools of thread, the half-finished banner stretched across the frame. "I had to threaten to fire half the palace staff before someone finally told me where you'd gone," he said, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Apparently your hiding spots are legendary." Lyric said nothing, because she couldn't. She just stared at him, drinking in the sight of him awake and whole and alive, even as dread pooled in her stomach. "We need to talk," Cassian continued, moving closer. "About what happened. About what you did." Lyric flinched. Here it came. The polite rejection, the explanation that true mate bonds were all well and good, but reality was more complicated. That he was grateful she'd saved his life, but a king couldn't actually bond with a servant, couldn't make someone like her his queen. She'd known this was coming, had known from the moment she ran, but knowing didn't make it hurt any less. Instead of speaking, Cassian did something unexpected. He signed, "Why did you run?" The question, asked in her own language, made Lyric's eyes burn with tears. She signed back, "Because I'm a servant and you're a king, and this is impossible." "Why is it impossible?" "Because," she struggled for the signs, her hands moving frantically, "because the council will never accept it. Because you need someone who can speak, who can be a proper queen. Because I have no family, no status, nothing to offer you politically. Because everyone will say you only bonded with me out of necessity, not choice." "And what do you think?" Cassian asked aloud, still watching her hands intently. "Do you think I bonded with you out of necessity?" Lyric hesitated, then signed, "I think the bond was there already. I felt it when I bit you. It was already there, waiting. So maybe it wasn't necessity, but it wasn't choice either. It just was. Just was." Cassian repeated softly. He took another step closer, now within arm's reach. "Can I tell you what I think?" Lyric nodded mutely at Cassian. "I think," Cassian said, "that I've been watching you for 5 years. I think every time I walked into a room, my eyes searched for copper hair and careful hands. I think I learned your schedule without meaning to. Found excuses to be in corridors I knew you'd be working in. I think I memorized the way you tuck your hair behind your ear when you're concentrating, the way you bite your lip when you're thinking through a problem." Lyric's breath caught. "I think," Cassian continued, his voice dropping lower, "that I told myself it was just attraction, that I was drawn to you because you were different, because you didn't fawn over me like the others. But watching you tonight, seeing you stand up when everyone else had given up, feeling that bond snap into place," he shook his head. "It wasn't necessity, Lyric, and it wasn't just the bond deciding for us. I chose you long before tonight. The bond just made it official." "I see, Manez." Tears were streaming down Lyric's face now. She signed, "But the council can adjust," Cassian interrupted. "I'm the king. I don't need their permission to choose my mate. But I can't speak. I can't fulfill the duties of a queen. I can't—" "You spent an entire night protecting me and managing a crisis situation without saying a single word," Cassian pointed out. "You coordinated the screening of 300 Omegas. You noticed details everyone else missed. You solved problems and made decisions, and kept everything from falling apart. If that's not queen material, I don't know what is." Cassian gently caught her hands, stopping her frantic signing. "No more buts. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need an honest answer. Forget about the council, forget about duty and politics and what you think you should say. Just answer truthfully." He waited until she nodded, then signed, "Do you want this? Do you want me?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Lyric looked into his storm-gray eyes and knew she could lie, could shake her head, could protect them both from the complications and difficulties that lay ahead. Could save him from having to fight his council, could save herself from the scrutiny and judgment of an entire kingdom. Should lie. But she was so tired of fear making her choices. She signed, Yes, I want this. I want you. Even though I'm terrified. Even though I don't know how to be what you need. Yes. The smile that broke across Cassian's face was like sunlight after a storm. That's all I needed to hear. He pulled her into his arms, and Lyric went willingly, pressing her face against his chest and letting herself be held. The bond in her chest settled, purring with contentment, feeling complete in a way she'd never experienced before. We'll figure it out, Cassian murmured against her hair. The council, the duties, all of it. Together. And for a moment, wrapped in his arms, Lyric let herself believe it could be that simple. But of course, the path ahead wouldn't be easy. Over the following weeks, Lyric was thrown into an intensive crash course in royal protocols, diplomatic procedures, and kingdom management. Mistress Adeline became her primary advisor, while Mirren helped her develop a system of hand signals that could be understood even by those who didn't know formal sign language. She attended council meetings, sitting quietly and absorbing information. She studied trade agreements and territory disputes. She learned the delicate dance of court politics. The council had been skeptical at first, suggesting she remain as Cassian's consort rather than queen, giving her time to prove herself, Cassian. But Cassian had made his position clear. Lyric was his mate and would be his queen, with all the respect and authority that entailed. Still, Lyric herself had proposed a compromise 3 months to demonstrate she could handle the responsibilities, working with the diplomatic corps and hosting at least one major function on her own. The council had agreed, though some members clearly expected her to fail. The breakthrough came during a diplomatic dinner with ambassadors from 3 neighboring territories. Ambassador Thrace from the Northern Territories, freed from his cell after King Valdis had been forced to issue a formal apology and pay substantial reparations, approached her partway through the evening. "Miss Lyric," he said carefully, "I wanted to personally apologize again for my role in the incident at the ceremony. I was used as a pawn, but that doesn't absolve me of responsibility." Lyric pulled out a small card she'd prepared, one of dozens Mirren had helped her create for common diplomatic phrases. This one read, "Your apology is accepted. We all make mistakes when we trust the wrong people." Thrace looked relieved. "You're very gracious. His Majesty is fortunate to have you." Another card. "I'm the fortunate one." The evening progressed smoothly until a moment of crisis. One of the ambassadors made a subtle but significant faux pas, insulting another territory's trade practices in a way that could have sparked a diplomatic incident. The table fell silent, tension crackling. Lyric caught Cassian's eye across the table, saw him preparing to intervene, but something made her move first. She stood, drawing everyone's attention. Then she did something unexpected. She laughed. Not out loud, of course, but the gesture was unmistakable. Hand over her mouth, shoulders shaking, eyes crinkled with mirth. The offending ambassador looked confused. I'm not sure I understand. Power." Lyric pulled out her slate and wrote quickly, then showed it around the table. "Ambassador Garrett, I believe you've confused the southern trade routes with the eastern merchant guilds. An easy mistake, I made it myself just yesterday." Perset. The similarities in their naming conventions are quite amusing. She'd given him an out. Let him save face by attributing his insult to simple confusion rather than deliberate offense. Garrett caught on immediately. "Ah, yes, of course. My apologies. I'm still learning the distinctions. Thank you for the correction, Miss Lyric." The tension dissolved. The dinner continued, and Lyric saw several council members exchange surprised looks. Later, as they prepared for bed, Cassian pulled her close. "That was brilliant," he said. "The way you diffused that situation, even Elder Mordecai was impressed. And he's never impressed." Lyric signed. "I just did what felt right. Sometimes silence gives you time to think before acting." "Which is exactly why you're going to be an amazing queen," Cassian said. "You see things others miss. You think before you speak or sign or write. You find creative solutions. And I'm still scared," Lyric admitted. "There's so much I don't know." "Then we'll learn it together," Cassian promised. "That's what partnerships are for." Lyric looked up at him, at this man who had chosen her over every political advantage, who had fought for her when it would have been easier to let her go, who believed in her, even when she struggled to believe in herself. And she signed, "I love you." It was the first time she'd said it, signed it, and Cassian's expression transformed into something so tender it made her chest ache. "I love you too," he said, signing it back to her. "My mate, my queen, my lyric potty." He kissed her then, deep and claiming, and the bond in her chest sang with perfect harmony. 3 months later, Lyric stood in the same grand hall where Cassian had announced her as his mate, but this time she wore a crown. The coronation had been magnificent, a blend of tradition and innovation that reflected exactly who they were as a couple. Cassian had modified several ceremonial elements to accommodate her silence, and Lyric had worked with scholars to develop new protocols that could serve as precedent for future nonverbal monarchs. The kingdom had watched with breathless attention as their unconventional queen took her vows not spoken, but signed in the old tongue, with Cassian repeating them aloud for the court. It had been beautiful, meaningful, and entirely theirs. Now, hours after the ceremony, most of the guests had departed. Lyric and Cassian stood on a private balcony overlooking the lunar gardens, enjoying a moment of peace. "So," Cassian said, pulling her back against his chest and wrapping his arms around her waist, "how does it feel to officially be Queen Lyric?" She signed, "Terrifying, exhilarating, like I might wake up any moment and discover it was all a dream." "Cassian, if it's a dream, we're both having it," Cassian murmured against her hair. "And I have no intention of waking up." Lyric turned in his arms to face him. Even after 3 months, even after countless hours spent together, the sight of him still made her breath catch. She'd never get used to this, to being loved, to being chosen, to being seen. "The council accepted me," she signed, still marveling at it. Elder Mordecai actually smiled during the ceremony. "That wasn't a smile," Cassian corrected with a grin. "That was his 'I suppose I was wrong but I'll never admit it out loud' expression. But yes, you won them over. Every last one of them." End quote. The 3 months had been grueling but transformative. Lyric had worked harder than she'd ever worked in her life, learning to navigate the complex world of royal governance. She'd made mistakes, plenty of them, but she'd also achieved victories. She'd successfully negotiated a trade dispute between two territories by facilitating written communication that forced both parties to think carefully about their words, rather than react emotionally. She'd organized a charity initiative for disabled children throughout the kingdom, creating a scholarship program for those who needed alternative forms of education. And perhaps most importantly, she'd learned to stop apologizing for her silence. Instead of seeing it as a weakness, she'd found ways to make it a strength. "I couldn't have done it without help," Lyric signed. "Mistress Adeline Mirren, you did it because you're brilliant and capable and stubborn enough to refuse to fail," Cassian countered. "We just provided support." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the night sounds of the garden below, crickets singing, a fountain splashing, the whisper of wind through leaves. "Can I tell you a secret?" Lyric signed eventually. "Always. That night at the ceremony, when I ran to you after you collapsed, I knew then, before the elixir, before the trials, before everything. I knew you were mine, and I was yours. I just didn't believe I was allowed to keep you." Cassian's arms tightened around her. "And now? Now I know that some things are worth fighting for," Lyric signed. "That being scared doesn't mean being wrong. That silence can be its own form of strength, and that sometimes the most impossible dreams are the ones worth chasing." "You've become quite philosophical, Your Majesty," Cassian teased gently. Lyric smiled and signed. "I learned from the best." "Liar," Cassian said affectionately. "You've always been the wise one. I'm just the fool who was smart enough to recognize it." He kissed her then, slow and deep, and Lyric melted into him, into this moment, into this life she'd never imagined she could have. When they finally pulled apart, Cassian rested his forehead against hers. "I have something for you," he said. "A coronation gift." He pulled a small scroll from his jacket and handed it to her. Lyric unrolled it carefully, then gasped. It was a royal decree, signed and sealed, establishing the first school for alternative communication in the 5 territories, a place where children who were deaf, mute, or otherwise unable to speak could receive quality education and learn the skills they'd need to thrive. The school would be called Lyric's Haven. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she looked up at him. "You changed my life," Cassian said simply. "You showed me and this entire kingdom that there are different ways to lead, different ways to communicate, different ways to be strong. I thought it was time we made sure every child who needs it has the same opportunities you fought so hard to create for yourself." Lyric couldn't sign, couldn't write, couldn't find any way to express the overwhelming love and gratitude flooding through her. So she just kissed him again, pouring everything she felt into it, hoping he could understand. From the way he held her fierce and tender, and absolutely certain she thought he did. 1 year later, Queen Lyric walked through the halls of the palace with a confidence she'd never imagined possessing. She'd just finished a successful diplomatic negotiation with the Northern Territories. King Valdis had been surprisingly easy to work with after the incident with the elixir, apparently nearly causing an international catastrophe, had humbled him considerably, and she was looking forward to a quiet evening with Cassian. As she passed through the servant corridors, she still preferred them to the main halls. Much to her guard's frustration, she spotted a young maid cowering against the wall, while a noble berated her for some minor infraction. Lyric stopped walking. The noble, sensing a presence, turned and paled when he saw who stood behind him. "Your Majesty, I was just—" Lyric held up a hand, stopping him. She'd developed a whole repertoire of gestures that were universally understood in the palace now. This one clearly meant, "Be silent." She turned to the young maid, who looked terrified, and signed, "Are you hurt?" The maid shook her head quickly. "Did you make a mistake?" A hesitant nod. "Will you fix it?" Another nod, more confident this time. Lyric smiled and touched the girl's shoulder gently, then handed her one of the cards she always carried. This one read, "Mistakes are how we learn. Don't let anyone make you feel small for being human." The maid's eyes filled with tears. She clutched the card and curtsied deeply. "Thank you, Your Majesty." Lyric turned back to the noble, her expression hardening. She didn't need words to convey her disapproval. The man actually took a step backward. She signed slowly, knowing he wouldn't understand but wanting to make her point anyway. "If I hear of you treating palace staff with anything less than respect, you'll answer to me personally. And I promise, you won't enjoy that conversation." Then she nodded to him a clear dismissal and continued on her way. As she turned the corner, she nearly collided with Cassian, who was grinning broadly. "I saw that," he said, very queenly. Lyric signed. "Was I too harsh?" "You were perfect," Cassian assured her. "Firm but fair, protective of those under your care. Exactly what a good queen should be." He offered his arm, and they walked together toward their private chambers. "Do you ever regret it?" Lyric signed as they walked. "Choosing me over someone who could have made everything easier?" Cassian stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Never," he said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You are the best decision I've ever made, the best thing that's ever happened to me, and the best queen this kingdom could have asked for." He paused, then added with a grin. "Plus, you're excellent at getting me out of boring diplomatic dinners by claiming we need to discuss urgent kingdom business in private." Lyric laughed silently and swatted his arm. "I love you," she signed. "I love you too," Cassian replied, signing it back to her, a habit he'd developed, speaking and signing simultaneously, so she always had his words in both languages. "My mate, my queen, my Lyric." As they entered their chambers together, Lyric thought about the girl she'd been a year ago, silent, invisible, convinced she had nothing to offer. She thought about all the fears she'd overcome, all the impossible things she'd achieved, all the ways she'd grown. But most of all, she thought about the moment she'd chosen to stop making herself smaller. The moment she'd chosen to fight for what she wanted. The moment she'd chosen to believe she was worth it. Every Omega had dreamed of being chosen by the Alpha King. But Lyric had done something better. She'd chosen herself. And that had made all the difference.